The Britons, who had been working tirelessly to defend democracy in the Empire against the perfidious Edwardians, whose only legitimacy came from the perfidious Yanks' scheming, were soon facing the full realities of war. The Royal Air Force and the Navy had been able to keep Britain relatively protected against any bombing runs that the French had given them, but now they were facing the full force of the Latin Axis. With support from the Edwardians, the Americans launched D-Day, but to many loyal Edwardians, from without and within the Home Isles, they would call it Operation Excalibur. Indeed, the Georgians may as well change their dynastic name back to Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, as day by day more and more land of the British Empire is lost, and the influence of Germany within the Saxon Allies grows. Even the Georgians' resistance against the rightful Edwardian restoration were being supported by German troops, quickly attempting to reinforce their would-be puppet Britain. How could the Edwardians not elect this conflict to the great battles of King Arthur, King of the Britons, who fought off the Saxons in their settlement of the British Isles? King Arthur may have been vanquished, and the Saxons had colonized England, but now, the Britons have a second chance to right this historical wrong and expel the Germanic invaders out from the Home Isles, as they both meet in Salisbury, where King Arthur was vanquished, for a battle that would decide the fate of the world. Welcome to the final episode of Project Stresa. As the Edwardians advanced into Salisbury, the British Home Guard had fortified the city heavily to withstand the unprecedented advance of the Americans' puppet regime. The city would hold out as they desperately waited for reinforcements to come from their allies. The situation was incredibly perilous for the Georgian government. Churchill would outwardly impose a stoicism and faith of their victory, but the British position was incredibly weak. Due to the lack of oil reserves prior to the American invasion, the UK fleet had to be mostly docked in order to save their oil supply in case of emergencies like this. While the Saxon Allies had managed to seize the oil-producing sectors in the Middle East, they had not transported the resources back to the British Isles, which would take a considerable amount of time. In an attempt to capitalize on this weakness, the Americans and British both had attempted to get Ireland on their side, each offering Northern Ireland as compensation. When Ireland had remained neutral, Latin Axis intelligence had triggered a fascist coup, mirroring the actions that they had taken in Britain, but this time with much more success. The former democratic government had gone into exile in Britain proper, as the Latin Axis occupied Ireland in its entirety. The Saxon Allies knew that this invasion was a last-ditch attempt to assert American dominance prior to a secondary ceasefire negotiation. They believed that if they were able to hold out for long enough in the British Isles, they would be able to eventually turn the tide by dominating the North Sea with the British fleet that had remained on standby once they could become active again. An alternative to this threat was the consideration of deploying tactical nukes to eliminate supply capabilities before pushing out the invader. This was deemed highly unacceptable, as if the Georgian government were to nuke their own citizens, it would cause a massive uproar and sway the entirety of the general public's opinion towards the Edwardian government. Nuclear strikes on America were considered, but given the distance that bombers would need to fly safely and the incredibly high chance of interception, it was unfeasible. Instead, the British nuke would be deployed on the Eastern Front, with the hope that with another nuclear strike, the Soviets would soon capitulate. With the Saxon Allies' desperate attempts to reach Baku, the Soviet soldiers were sent to cut off the Saxon Allies from their main supply chain by seizing Azov. A large offensive was undertaken, but the Saxon Allies had managed to hold out. Normally, such an offensive would have been a death knell for the advancing forces. But after 5 years of war, destroyed infrastructure via bombings, fighting a war on 3 to 4 fronts, a lack of American supplies, friendly Russian collaborators, and a nuclear-capable opponent, the Soviets were exhausted and without suitable arms to resist the Saxon Allies any further. The counteroffensive was cut short, as Stalin had ordered the remaining forces to defend Moscow to the last man and continue their policy of scorched earth. The Soviets' goal was to divert more troops away from the Siberian front in order to defend the homeland. Their hope was that the partisan efforts within Japan's sphere of influence would eventually lead to their downfall, especially with the Americans gaining a vital strategic location in the Pacific with the advent of the Australian and New Zealandic defections. These troops would begin mobilizing en masse throughout the railway systems to reach the homeland. The Saxon Allies were aware of this strategy and began a pincer movement, beginning their attempts to encircle the entirety of the Soviet capital in order to cut off any further supplies or reinforcement prior to deploying the British nuke against the Soviet capital. With the Saxon Allies encroaching further into Soviet lands, many civilians had had enough of the war. The indomitable spirit of the Russians had been infused with the belief in communism, but now people were beginning to become ambivalent to class struggle and would rather live in peace than constant class warfare. For these reasons, when Leningrad is once again encircled, the local garrisons surrender within days, not eager to withstand yet another siege and terrified of the rumors of Stalingrad's vaporization. As Stalin began ordering for the destruction of local industries to avoid them getting into the hands of the Russian collaborators, Stalin was eventually couped by traitors within his government who wished for the war to end. These elements of the military had done so in fears that the Saxon Allies would nuke Moscow like they had Stalingrad, and saw the leniency with the citizens of Leningrad as a sign that surrendering to the Saxon Allies would be the best way to ensure the livelihood of their citizens at the end of the conflict. Stalin and his loyalist cabinet would attempt to vacate quickly to Tomsk in order to establish resistance against the Germans and British. However, he would be recognized on his way there by the locals, who would be summarily executed as they gave him the punishment that he had threatened his soldiers if they had taken one step back. This total surrender had the Saxon Allies splitting Russia between their two rival governments. On paper, the Japanese puppet government of the Russian fascists would gain everything up to the Urals, while everything west of them was given to the Saxon Allied democratic elements. However, in reality, there was incredible, unprecedented amounts of resistance. From the armies encircled in the Caucasus and the populations that were still loyal to communism, throughout the entire Union, they would not surrender, even without leadership from Moscow. The main difference between these two rival governments was their capability to deal with the resistance. The European Saxon Allies were lenient and merciful where possible, but the Japanese were ruthless and took no prisoners. And while the history of exactly what took place after the occupation of the USSR had been poorly documented and without any true consensus as to what happened after the surrender, there was one thing that was certain: how it ended. The final battle of the Atlantic War raged on, and while the USA was making significant gains, news of Soviet capitulation reached the soldiers on both sides of the conflict. This news was incredible to hear for the Saxon Allies, as their victory drew nearer and nearer, but was also devastating for the Latin Axis, as now the Germans would be able to divert all their forces towards their nations. The British and their nuclear bomb had not been deployed, and now could be used against the Latin Axis. There was a significant potential for the Saxon Allies to gain a total victory in the continent. Not only that, but the general strike at home was causing significant unrest, with local unions now brandishing weaponry against vigilante Minutemen who were determined to destroy the enemy within. Dewey was put in an impossible position. He was being pressured by the pro-war faction of his country to continue pushing the advantage and secure Europe for America. But every day that he refused to negotiate terms, he risked allowing a communist revolution to rise at home, which would guarantee the Saxon Allies total victory in Europe anyway. Despite the anxiety, he persistently told the people of America to restart work, and they would leave the conflict once the rightful King of Britain sat on his throne. These efforts were completely in vain, as they did not accept the Edwardian government in the first place. And while the Germans were capable of nuclear strikes, the Americans were in the midst of developing their own as well. While it would not be nearly as complete as the bombs of our histories, the Americans still had a few of the scientists that helped create the bomb. American high command was convinced that if they obtained a similar weapon to Fenrir, they would be able to tactically deploy it and secure Europe for themselves. However, things changed after the Soviets collapsed. The Germans were able to commit all their forces to the battles in Britain and Europe, with Britain boasting about their nuclear bomb and the extremely high possibility that Germany could manufacture more. The decision of whether or not to stay and fight in Europe became much more simple, especially when Germany had offered to betray Japan. It is no secret that the Germans had no love for the Japanese in this timeline. The introduction of Japan to the Saxon Allies was a measure that was truthfully only in the service of the British. It was a major malefactor to the German economy, where the Kuomintang were subjugated by the Japanese, as the Chinese Republic was a major trading partner with Germany. And with the event of a Saxon Allied victory, Japan would ensure that these goods would come with heavy tariffs as they solidified their economic control of their puppet. And, of course, the main problem. The only reason why Germany was at war with the USA was because of the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now that, at least on paper, the Saxon Allied Russian Empire was in control of all of European Russia, there was now a reason for Germany to go to war with Japan. Support the Russian Empire in their reclamation of Siberia. Germany would be in favor of such an arrangement, as it would vastly improve their relations with the Russian government, and that's very important when you consider that they had just nuked them. However, this limited peace would come with several conditions. Many of these conditions were outlined in the 1944 peace talks, but were updated to suit the new situation. Germany demanded that the original plans of having a split France and Italy between Saxon Allied and Latin Axis aligned governments to be respected. Even without Free France controlling northern France anymore, they would need to accept their restoration. This is an unnegotiable demand due to Germany's strategic interests of creating a buffer state between themselves and the Latin Axis. Germany had also demanded that the Americans withdraw entirely from Britain and stop supporting the Edwardian government's claim to Britain. With the war reaching the home isles, there was now no demanding any sort of imperial restoration by the Georgians, so the previous malefactor of British chauvinism would no longer be in the way of peace negotiations. However, the Irish fascistic government would remain and keep control over Northern Ireland. Due to Britain and their weakness, the possibility of appeasing the Italians' claims on Britain was now finally possible. Germany would allow for Italian claims on British colonies to be respected and withdraw support for the Ethiopian government, allowing for the Italians to reclaim their empire. But in exchange, the Suez would need to remain as an international zone and not controlled exclusively by the Latin Axis. The majority of Britain's Oceanian colonies would be signed away, but Dutch control over the East Indies and British control over Malaya would need to be respected. These resources were vital for the economies of the Saxon Allies and would need to be accepted by the Latin Axis for any sort of coordinated attack on Japan to occur. The Latin Axis would accept the Saxon Allies' designs on their former allies' lands of Bulgaria and Hungary. In the end, Bulgaria and Albania would be integrated into Yugoslavia, and the Romanians would seize the eastern bank of the Tisa River, with the rest becoming a supervised state of Germany. And lastly, the Americans would need to accept that there would be no war reparations on either side of the conflict. While this deal was mostly one-sided, it all came with the addition that Germany would turn on the Japanese, opening another front with them and their allies in the West, and neutralize the threat of a communist revolution in America. For all these reasons, Dewey would accept this deal. Peace has finally returned to Europe. As America had accomplished their mission of eliminating threats to democracy in Europe, and the Germans declaring war on the Japanese, they can now focus all their assets to the Pacific War. The USA continues to win major naval battles against the Japanese, especially with reinforcements coming from the Atlantic Navy reaching the Pacific. Any resources that Japan could have possibly extracted from Siberia are thoroughly denied, as German and ROA soldiers establish order in Siberia. The communist resistance cells that had been fighting Japanese occupation would be America's greatest ally in overthrowing Japanese dominance in the Pacific, but would never collaborate with any Germans due to the unspeakable horrors that they had inflicted on the workers of Stalingrad. This would play to America's benefit, as if the Germans were able to reach further into Siberia, they would grow much more powerful. In order to prevent the Saxon Allies from gaining too much land, America would support Mao Zedong and his liberation movement, as well as any Soviet-aligned separatists in attempts to create buffer states between the Germans and American spheres of influence in Asia. With all of Japan's former allies turning on them, and the full force of the Americans surrounding their island, a brutal firebombing campaign would begin. Entire villages, made completely of wood, would be destroyed. This is around when America would have dropped their bombs on Japan, like our history. But their bombs were still incomplete, with no successful tests to be deployed. Therefore, instead of 2 nukes leading to a cooperative Japanese emperor, the Americans would navally invade Japan instead. They would succeed in capturing the south of the island as they began to attempt to secure it in its entirety. However, this also led to a communist Japanese uprising in the north to occur at the same time. Both the communists and Americans would quickly occupy Japan, with America managing to capture the seat of the empire in Tokyo, dividing Japan between an American occupation and the communist Japanese Republic. As Germany continued to push into Siberia, the communists of the Far East would unite to prevent any further attempts to suppress communism and resist capitalism. With the aid of the Americans, the reorganized government of China would dissolve and be transferred wholly to the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong. This would prove extremely fortuitous to the Americans and their designs against allowing German influence to reach the Pacific, as the Far Eastern communists would work together with Mao Zedong in order to push back German troops. While they could not prevent the Germans from taking vital cities like Omsk, they were able to resist German imperialism and stop their advance. With no way for Germany to reach the rest of Russia, it too was back into the hands of communists. But by then, the war was over. The Chinese and others managed to defeat the Japanese Empire. The world was finally at peace by 1946. At last, the conflict was at an end. The Second World War would take the lives of millions, soldiers and civilians alike. In the homeland of the major powers, there was a sense of great jubilation, but still a sense of dread. As for many, the conflict was not over. The peace between DC and Berlin was all but in name a ceasefire, with influenced governments splitting previously whole nations into 2. Italy was devastated, but France was eviscerated by the scars of war. A civil war and 3 large offensives saw many previously brilliant cities falling to ruin. The previous hegemon of the Latin Axis now lay ripe for the superpowers of the world to repair their nation, in turn for their subjugation to these titans. The Saxon Allies had managed to defeat their foes, but cracks within the alliance are beginning to show. Barely holding on until the end of the war, the border disputes and ideological rifts between the core members of the Saxon Allies were now impossible to ignore. And yet, they needed to keep themselves together, lest they be divided and conquered by DC. The public in America had become permanently scarred by the general strike of 1945. Even until the end of the conflict, the local police forces were struggling to properly re-establish control as communist cells are fighting for their lives against a democracy with no tolerance for socialism. And despite the peace, conflict is still raging across the world. Communist resistance in the Russian Empire, chaos in the Middle East, separatists fighting Azad Hind, and more anti-colonial sentiments in Africa are all intensifying. And soon, a breaking point will be reached, and the potential for another world conflict looms in the balance. However, the human race cannot withstand another conflict, as any future conflict guarantees the destruction of civilizations across the world, as these superpowers both have nuclear weapons. Weapons of destroying entire cities with one detonation. The Germans would produce more after the Americans successfully test their nuke in 1947. The survival of the human race would depend on their ability to keep a cool head and keep the war cold. But could the Americans afford to allow communism to fester in Eurasia? Here lies the end of the story for Project Stresa, an alternate World War II. The foundation for a bipolar and potentially tripolar Cold War had been laid. However, before I delve into this timeline further, I require much more research, time, and care. In the future, I will be working on bonus episodes for Project Stresa, outlining other endings that I had considered for this timeline, and create an epilogue, which would serve as the jumping off point for a potential Season 2. Until then, I will be working on my other projects, including Project Bourbon, Aftershocks of the Revolution Redux lore videos, and a new project, Project German October. Thank you so much for watching Project Stresa. What I thought would have been a 4-episode sideshow has become the main project of my channel, and I'm so glad you've all watched up until now. If you liked the video, please give it a like. And if you want to see what I have cooked up next, please consider subscribing. Now, your lore dad seriously needs a break. I've been on total mob for way too long, and now I'm getting general strikes. I need to demobilize the economy. I'll see you when I see you.